It is a great pleasure to be here, in part just because I am delighted to see some genuine attention focused on this really important issue, and to see an effort to have a conversation not just mostly among cultural memory people, but really across the entire range from the people creating this material to the folks who need to make sure that it's available for future generations. And I also really resonate with the implicit appeal in the title of this to Orwell and all of the sort of social issues that raises and connects with, because there is more at stake here than simply preserving cultural heritage. I mean, there's an enormous set of institutions that do this broadly, and they try and preserve creative output, scholarly output, journalism, many other things for the future. But news has kind of a special place, and it is unquestionably an important part of our cultural heritage, but it has dimensions that go beyond that. So I thought the place I would start, a bit at the risk of preaching to the choir, is to talk a little bit about why preserving news is so important. What that special role is that journalism plays. And I think revisiting some of this will be helpful, because after talking about this for a couple of minutes, I'm going to move on to some of the specific challenges that we face as we move into the digital arena. And some of these questions are really hard and are sort of fundamentally almost philosophical in nature. We're going to have to make some choices about genuinely what it means to preserve journalism into the future. And the answers to the proper choices are not entirely clear. So it's helpful to, as a kind of a touchstone, remember some of what's driving this and some of what makes journalism special. So let me start by suggesting that we all know, I think, how important journalism is as evidence for scholarly work going into the future. It's no accident that organizations like the National Endowment for the Humanities have made an important funding priority for locating, inventorying, and ultimately digitizing historic newspapers, not just the couple of big ones, but historic newspapers from every city and town and region in America going all the way back. The multiplicity of uses that scholars have found for the historic body of journalism are astounding. I mean, you start, of course, naturally by thinking historians of various ilks. Then you quickly realize that this extends into sociologists, into economists, into people interested in all aspects of the development of culture and public thought. It goes on and on and on. City planners, architects, all of these folks find important value and significance in having access to that corpus of material. So the scholarly issue is simply not at question. This is a body of evidence that touches an enormous number of humanities, of social sciences, and indeed even the hard sciences, as we try and understand everything from changes in public health over the centuries to how the human diet has changed, to climate change, and all kinds of other matters of interest to the scientific community. The second reason, and this is the one that is so special, is that the news is, and the history of news is not just for scholars, it's for everyone. It is a fundamental accountability mechanism and memory for democracy, for civil society, for all of our public institutions, for anybody trying to get a grip on how we got where we are today and where we're headed. That is a special function of journalism in a democracy, and at least on good days, you will find that the government does recognize some of that special place of journalism. You see it clearly framed in the Constitution, in the most foundational thinking of at least our nation here, and I hope some other nations. So losing that is just really, in my view, unacceptable. We can't do it. We've got to maintain it. And having confidence, or at least a reasonable level of confidence that you'll be able to keep most of it across long periods of time, says that we need to be able to distribute that stewardship responsibility among many organizations that draw from many pools of resource. And to my mind, that says the public sector, the not-for-profit sector, the private sector all play a role in here. And that the notion of putting all of our bets on any single point is just too risky to do. We have to find ways, just as we found with printed newspapers 100 years ago, to ensure that those survive on across time. And if you think of the roads those printed newspapers took, it's everything from individuals who saved issues in their attics, all the way through thrift shops, archives of the actual newspapers themselves, public libraries who acquired this material, research libraries who acquired the material, copyright deposit into the federal government. All of those played a role in the preservation of this. And an amazing amount of this material survived. We tend to focus on the losses, but really, if you think about it, an astounding amount of that heritage has survived several hundred years in some cases, much of it characterized by benign neglect more than anything else, and the occasional historical enthusiast. There's a third reason, too, why we need to preserve the record of journalism. Journalism not only documents what's going on in our society and our civic institutions and our business institutions and our economy and the actions of individuals, it also interacts with it. It shapes those actions in a very profound way. And the details of that have shifted over the years. But certainly the interplay between journalism and diplomacy, journalism and politics, journalism and public opinion is very complex and involves lots of back and forth feedback loops. It involves, in some cases, efforts to shape that thinking through journalism coming from some specific perspectives and sectors. It is an integral part, of course, of the political process, inevitably. And we need to understand not just what happened, but in fact, how the processes of journalism shaped and affected what happened. That is important too, and we can't understand that without a record of this journalism. It's worth noting, by the way, how amazingly ephemeral other parts of these processes are. For example, have you ever wondered what happens to all of those zillions of political websites the day after the election? They just sort of go away. Now, there are a few organized projects. The Library of Congress has done work in this area, especially in some of the presidential elections, the Internet Archive, some universities, to capture these, at least at some level, reasonably systematically. But so much of these conversations, so much of these influences are very ephemeral, and I don't think we want the news to go that way. In fact, the news, the record of journalism is in some sense a very good window into these other more ephemeral things that are happening to influence public opinion. So those are some of my thinking about the arguments I'd make for the particular importance and particular public interest in preserving access to the record of journalism. Now, with that as backdrop, I want to turn to the world of born digital journalism, whatever that means, and I'm really kind of uneasy about that term because, in fact, it's kind of a mix of things that have their heritage in video and audio, in radio and television, although now the signals are typically either captured digitally or very rapidly become digital as part of their management and delivery. It certainly includes lots of words that come from textual traditions of newspapers. It includes some genuine new things. One of the things that's happened, curiously enough, I think, particularly in the past decade, is that certain kinds of journalism have become much more data-driven. And the data is now not just summarized and synthesized as part of the journalistic process, but actually is getting more and more in the reader's domain as you see the more extensive adoption of things like interactive graphics that can be driven not just by a person anchoring election coverage or something, but in fact can be called up by individual end consumers on a website. All of those are part of this body of digital news. I think we also see that digital news kind of highlights the convergence of a lot of different delivery channels. Almost any broadcast news outlet that's on television has a partner website and makes extensive cross-referencing back and forth. There's a lot of consolidation and interconnection between broadcast and print. That's becoming more and more commonplace. It's getting really hard to tell where one leaves off and the other begins, especially when the print isn't print anymore. It's really website. So the kind of traditional silos here, I would say, are shakier than they've ever been. And we're starting to see news creep in kind of a funny way into social media as well. I don't think that's a process that we understand very well at this point, but it's certainly a presence. It's not entirely clear to me how much genuinely new stuff is being presented there into these social media platforms that isn't being readily replicated other places. But what is different is the way it propagates and the way it elicits comment and discussion around it. I think, honestly, that we're all trying, and this is not just in the journalism world, but actually in many, many contexts, to understand the interactive nature of people being able to comment on things that are posted on the web. When you look at an article and you find, 900, 2,000 comments, you have to, that's a lot of comments. You don't know what to do with it. You can do sentiment analysis computationally to decide which ones are, I don't know what the right word is, which ones are very ideological and from which camp they are ideological in commenting on it. But you often pick up things that are reflected in corrections or genuine additional dimensions to the article in question in some cases. And so when you start thinking about the preservation of news, what do you do with those comments? You redo your website every few years. You've got a new comment managing mechanism. Do you bring forward you certainly bring forward the old articles. Do you bring forward the old comments too? That's a lot of work. We don't know, what sort of gray area those inhabit. But having said that, let me just take you through some of the things that are really hard here. The first, and I'm not even going to really get into this in any detail, is the business of copyright and how copyright connects up to both the ability to preserve material and to reformat it as various kinds of standards and practices change within cultural memory organizations, and the kind of deeper issue of what would I call it, incentives and motivations. And let me just kind of illustrate it this way. Now, today we've seen, well, in the last couple of decades, we've seen astounding extensions to the term of copyright. Used to be that back in the world of physical things, if you were, say, a library, you could acquire a physical book, you could loan it out, and you could do that legally under copyright, and that's much murkier when you talk about electronic material and licenses and all this negotiated stuff. And even better, at the end of something reasonable like 25, 30 years, that material would pass into the public domain and other people could reuse it and build upon it and repurpose it in various ways. The Disney company did very well by repurposing a rich public domain in folk tales and related material, for example. But then all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, it was really a lengthy multi-decadal process. They started extending these copyright terms to the point where now, you're looking at a 100-year kind of copyright term. So, and by the way, depending on who you ask, you can probably get pretty good odds that nothing will ever again go into the public domain other than things created by the federal government, because they will just keep extending the term as it looks like the public domain is going to reopen for business. Where's the incentive there? How do you justify as a cultural memory organization, even if you can legally collect material, not being able to show it to anyone for 100 or more years? That's a really tough investment case to make, or to only be able to show it under incredibly constrained circumstances. We need to think through that, and think through that in the context of the value of archival news, and the public policy importance of archival news. And it may be very well that we get different answers for different kinds of news and different scales of news. We have certain kinds of provisions built into the existing copyright law that support preservation by cultural memory organizations. It's fairly clear to most people who've looked at this that these are inadequate for the digital world, and there have been some efforts to map out amendments and extensions to them, but so far this mostly hasn't happened. But I will just immediately circle the whole problem of copyright as a really large problem, and it's both a business problem and a public policy problem. I would invite you for a kind of depressing case study in many ways. to look at the Vanderbilt Broadcast News Archive and how that's played out over the last couple of decades financially and in terms of overall impact. They started filming the evening news on the 3 channels, remember when there were basically 3 channels, way back in the 60s. And they've got an enormous archive of this material. But the impact of it has been very, very muted because they haven't been able to clear permissions to do very much with it from most of the broadcasters. Yet an incredible amount of our history is locked up in there. Remember that there was a day when most of the population of America was getting a lot of their news from one of those 3 evening newscasts. I mean, those were enormous social forces in the 60s and early 70s that, are basically off limits to most people most of the time. Kind of amazing. Let me move on, though, to some of the other issues, because I think that there's lots more here, and there are places where we can have some very, very important conversations beyond the legal sphere. So let's just start with kind of examining some news formats and some of the realities of these. So we talked a little bit already about what do you do with comments that come in as news is presented online, and how does that relate to the news? You're seeing a lot of news that's composite now. It's assembling on some site various kinds of data feeds from different sources as well as actual reportage. I invite you to spend half an hour watching one of the financial channels, CNBC or Bloomberg, and just look at the number of feeds that are converging in on that screen. What is the underlying news there? Is it what you'd see with a camera in front of that screen if you just recorded the screen, or should you be picking it apart into sources? And by the way, all of those sources come from different places in many instances and have different constraints around them, and basically they've just got a deal worked out where they can merge them and broadcast them, which is very different than what you'd have to do in order to preserve it. Take another kind of look at this besides compositeness. There's vast redundancy in a lot of broadcast news. All of a sudden we have a lot of channels and we have a lot of airtime to fill. And so we see these kind of weird processes where a tremendous amount of material is repeated every 10 or 15 minutes, but there's also new stuff sneaking in all the time. And maybe some of your bits of the screen, be it a website, be it a TV broadcast, are repetitive, and some aren't. How do you extract out the changes there, or is this just too complicated? Do you maybe only hack away at this at a kind of a macro scale where, when they rebroadcast Meet the Press for the 7th time in the wee hours of the night or on different channels, you say, oh yeah, well, it's the same broadcast and I really only need to keep one of them. I don't know. I don't know what the right answers are here, and maybe the answers are multi-level. Maybe you do a certain amount of documenting of how it looked to the viewer, and you do other documenting that or archiving that tries to focus on the underlying content and how it's arranged. Let's move on to something more challenging: personalization. It seems very reasonable to talk about preserving the web until you realize that today, in most cases, everybody sees a different web. Every time they visit it, every person sees a different one. Sometimes it depends on what computer you're coming in from and what cookies and things you happen to have parked on there. I had an absolutely hilarious anecdote talking with someone the other week. They had been doing some work on archiving government websites. And they suddenly realized that there were like 4 or 5 programmers in a kind of an open, area room working on this and testing it. And they suddenly realized that all 4 or 5 of these people were seeing a different thing when they went to whitehouse.gov. It gives you a really confident feeling in, the solidity of that record. But in fact, that's what's happening on most news sites. You're seeing things that are tailored to your location. You're getting ads that are tailored to your history and what it thinks it knows about you demographically. You're getting stories that are selected sometimes based on an interest profile you've given it, or even better, an interest profile that's inferred, if you're anonymous, from all of the demographic kinds of things it can guess about you. In fact, a genuinely astounding experience is to watch the kind of network ballet that occurs when you hit the front page of one of the major newspaper sites, something like the Wall Street Journal. In fact, they have more different trackers and demographic gatherers and other computational sorts of things going on there than you would believe that are happening. Literally, there are dozens of cookies and other things being passed around. There's a lot going on behind the scenes there, and it affects, of course, what you see. The other thing that, of course, is happening is that these are feeding computational algorithms that help to drive the website, which take those demographics as input, look at what happens to be in the database that's recent, and then does some kind of computation and gives you a front page. And this is an idea, by the way, that goes back a long time. You remember the early days of the internet with the MIT Media Lab and Nicholas Negroponte talking about the Daily Me? You'd come on the net and find the Daily Me. Well, that's an aspect of, what journalism looks like to the public today. And again, gets at this dichotomy between what's actually in the corpus of journalism and what's shown to who when. But the point I want to come back to just for a second is that those algorithms are being tweaked all the time to try and make them better, to try and make visitors to the site stay longer and go away more satisfied. So the notion of capturing, in some sense, a constantly changing, algorithmically driven display is fundamentally just impossible. This selection by algorithm is terribly pervasive. If we have time later, there's a very interesting incident that happened earlier this year where, well, I'll just tell the story quickly. Earlier this year, there was a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science by some researchers from Cornell and some folks from Facebook. And what they were trying to do was, Facebook computationally gives you this feed of stuff when you go on it, every time you visit. And Facebook has literally thousands of people who do nothing but spend their time fiddling with this algorithm and tracing, variations and how that correlates to dwell time on the site and how many ads they can show you and other sorts of things. And, Facebook is by no means unique in this. They're just, a large player. So there is a theory that has been floating around about emotional contagion. Basically, the idea here is that if all your friends are posting depressing stuff, you'll tend to post depressing stuff. And if they post cheery stuff, you'll reflect that too. Not an entirely implausible thing. So instead of tweaking the algorithms to optimize dwell time on the site, what these researchers did is said, well, let's bias the algorithm for some people to prefer sort of depressing stuff based on some lightweight kind of sentiment analysis. And for other people, cheerful stuff, and then we'll analyze those postings and see if we can prove or disprove this. And when the paper went out, an enormous number of people just went ballistic. Where was the Institutional Review Board? How can you be doing this with human subjects? What are the ethics here? There was no informed consent. And I won't get into the argument pro and con there, which is a very interesting one. I'll simply observe that there was this bizarre notion that you could see among the general public that there was one sort of true Facebook algorithm for constructing that feed that had been handed down in the dawn of time and had been, sacred and, inviolable since then, when in fact nothing could be farther from the truth. And same deal applies in any complex website that is merging demographics, personal preferences, and a dynamic database off the back. And that's most big news sites. So we just have to kind of get over that and move beyond it. But that does frame this question very squarely about how does personalization interact with our efforts to preserve journalism? How much do we care about how many people saw what, for example, as opposed to what was in the database? If you have an article in the database that nobody was seeing, very few people looked at, you only found if you searched, somehow do we want to record that and understand that that had less impact than something else that was splashed across, 5 million site visitors on a given day? I don't know. It seems we probably want to capture some of that, but this is a very, very complicated and challenging area. And to be perfectly honest, this is sort of like secret sauce for a lot of sites too. How to make those choices and make them in ways that are most responsive to their visitors. They'll talk in general terms about the factors they're looking at, but the specifics are, move very definitely into trade secret territory. Let me look at another important change that I think has taken place in news, particularly as it moves to the digital era. And that is that news has become very interlinked. And source material that was formerly mostly only accessible to reporters and journalists is now brought forward in the context of a news report so that individual readers can go back to the source material and make their own assessment. Just, I invite you to go around the web a bit, look at some news reportage, look at all of the links to press conferences where you can actually, you're not, in the written thing, you might get a little clip or a quote from somebody at the press conference, but you can actually go and look at the entire underlying press conference, which usually, by the way, isn't on the news platform site. It's linked out to some government or corporate or other site that may or may not have any interest in keeping it, and in fact, very much in the spirit of when there is regime change in Washington, they throw away all the old websites and put in new ones for a lot of the agencies. They may have active reasons to want this to disappear at some point. Now, you start thinking about what does it mean to preserve this? Do you follow the underlying links? Do you have the rights to follow the underlying links? How do you synchronize the stability or ephemerality of the material that's being pointed to with your thinking about the reportage that uses that for evidence? There's stuff here that, frankly, I don't understand at all from a legal point of view. Government press conferences, probably are pretty public. Think about the endless press conferences related to professional sports events. Now, at least some of those leagues, like the National Football League, tend to be pretty possessive about that material. And I've never really been able to run this down, but somehow I'm thinking they might be less than enthused if cultural memory institutions went around vacuuming those up because they were referenced off of sports reportage articles. I don't know. Companies come and go, too. A very popular genre of corporate footage, at least in certain sectors, are rocket launches by some of these new startups that are trying to contract services to NASA. So every time they, run a test launch, they usually stream it out on the web, and there are a lot of people who like to watch these. Every now and again, one will blow up. Then that'll get on the news. The articles will typically have a pointer off to the corporate provided launch video. How stable is that? These are startup companies in many cases. We could draw many, many, many other examples here, particularly things that involve performances and art criticism and things like that, where you get into very tricky kinds of multi-layered rights that are hard to disentangle. But I'll just highlight one other one that's very funny. We've had a kind of a strange resurgence of gray literature in the web environment. What happens is that you see lots of commissions or public interest groups or things like this, often with quite unstable funding, that will come together and will issue a report of some sort. On some social problem or a proposal for doing something. And that will be very available for a while. It'll typically be up as a PDF on a website, and they'll often have a few pages of summary, and then the main document is a PDF somewhere. Now, back in the old days when they used to print this, these were really hard to get a hold of. You had to be interested enough to write to these guys, maybe send them a few dollars for a printed copy. There were libraries who acquired this kind of material in particular areas very systematically, particularly some research libraries that followed policy formulation in specific areas. So there was a good long-term record, but there was pretty crummy short-term access for the general public. You had to really want to get this and know how to get it. And so you typically rely on perhaps an article in a newspaper or a magazine for a summary of it, and that was as far as it went. Now that source material is very available in the short term and is often linked to newspaper articles or other reportage that's covering it. But nobody's keeping the underlying reports, and nobody really grabs it for the long term. The kind of bulk web archiving that people like the Internet Archive do typically does not follow links to non-HTML pages and pull down masses of PDF documents that are behind links. It's just too storage intensive. So this is another very good example of where the cultural memory sector and the journalism sector need to kind of think and work together to ensure that this reportage, this journalism that's produced, is still functional in the long term. It has as many of its links working as possible, or enough information that you might be able to reconstruct the link and find the document elsewhere. And I think this is a very, very big challenge. So one way of thinking about this is that journalism now exists in a web of other things from other sources that constitute evidence or extension of the journalism. Another way to think about it is that we're in an environment where the boundaries of the journalistic enterprise are getting less and less clear as things are incorporated by reference rather than physically imported, if you'll allow me the analogy, into the digital sites and archives that are run by the news organizations themselves. That takes me to another issue, maybe the last that I'll mention in this sort of survey of things that are hard problems that we really need to talk through. And that's the scale of news today. News used to be really scarce. In really olden times, it was a tremendously scarce commodity, and there were people who brought it from place to place. Now we are drowning in it from every direction. We have all of these channels to fill, all of this airtime, all of these websites to populate every day. We see new players coming into the journalistic enterprise, so-called hyperlocal news, an endless array of very specialized news sites serving specific interests or specific industry sectors or other kinds of things, and the ability to amass audience on the internet that shares a common interest has enabled the seemingly endless proliferation of these kinds of sites, especially when you couple this with the pretty low initial cost of entry to set up a blog that is doing something more or less journalistic in a very specific area. And those blogs in some cases are very important and draw enormous audiences. So where do we put lines around this? How do we delineate the scope of the journalistic enterprise? Do we do this by practices, by impact? This whole question of how do you decide who's a reporter these days, and the credentialing of reporters has gotten to be a very contentious business in some settings. And certainly when we think about the preservation of journalism, we see something that's both broader and less clear-cut than those kinds of challenges. So, at the extreme end, we have efforts to mobilize citizen journalism and citizen reporting. And it's very clear that there are some important things that are coming out of that. When you look at the consequences of the fact that everybody has a camera on their phone with them now all the time, and you look at what's happened in response to various kinds of large-scale events and disasters, and the floods of images that come in that are part of, in some very real sense, the reportage on those events, we need to think about what's to do with that. So let me close these remarks, because I do want to allow a few minutes for a couple of questions or comments, with one sort of last cluster of questions. In the digital world, barring changes in public policy that I don't see happening real soon now, there is a particular set of challenges for preservation. Essentially, most cultural memory organizations cannot readily, at least, decide unilaterally to preserve a lot of things. They actually need the at least passive and sometimes active collaboration and consent of the content creators and the content deliverers. I think that news increasingly moves into the category where you need some passive, certainly, but probably even active engagement between content producers and those who worry about the cultural memory side of things. Is that one of the things we ought to be thinking about as we think about what constitutes responsible journalistic activity, given, taking you back to my opening remarks, that very special role of journalism in our society? Do we need to think about ensuring the preservation as part of an agenda of values and activities that constitute genuinely responsible journalistic work? We've certainly seen, I think, very timely, thoughtful, and again, difficult conversations about how do other facets of journalistic practice change in the digital world. For example, excuse me, things like newspapers or other channels that report the police blotter. And so you pick up names of people who have been arrested or brought into the station or something, and that sits around forever just waiting to be Googled. But unfortunately, there's no follow-up, that there were no charges, they were dismissed, mistaken identity, found innocent, et cetera, et cetera. You miss all of the kind of follow-on and just get that damaging initial announcement. And I think that some journalistic outlets have appropriately struggled with, what's the right thing to do here? And in a world where you can find anybody, no matter how, passingly mentioned by search, does that put more burden on ensuring closure around certain kinds of reportage? Maybe this is a question like that. It certainly, I would propose, is something that, because the stakes are so high, demands some focused thinking and discussion, and I hope that one of the things we can do here is to advance that conversation a bit. So with that, I thank you, and I hope that some of these thoughts and questions, and I'm afraid I've given you a lot more questions than answers, will be helpful in the conversations at this conference going forward. Thanks.
So we've got about 10 minutes if people want to ask questions.
We'll use the mic, so since it's live streaming, so we'll come around and to ask the questions.
Questions, comments?
I think of all of us in the room, sorry, this is Catherine Skinner, Educopia Institute, but of all of us in the room, you are one of the most traveled. And so you're seeing a lot of things internationally as well as nationally. Can you talk a little bit about any countries or any spaces where you see work going on that maybe we should be paying attention to here in the States and try to replicate in some manner?
That's a really good question, and I actually, at some level, need to calibrate expectations. I really am not that knowledgeable about this internationally. The coalition's work is, absolutely predominantly in North America, although we have some very important connections and conversations with members and other colleagues in a number of European countries and just a few linkages beyond that. But part of the problem with news, as I indicated, is it is so embedded in cultural context that I would be very reluctant to point at some nation or some project and say they've really got it right. I don't have that depth of knowledge. I will say that there are some things that are on my radar screen that are terrifying for reasons that involve the preservation of news but go far beyond that. Notably, this whole thing that's coming out of Europe about the right to be forgotten. And some of the ramifications of that are just unbelievably horrible. It's hard for me to imagine something like that really taking off here, given that there are what looks to me to be some pretty good constitutional arguments against it in many cases, but that one is really scary. I think that there are also there's some deep questions that are emerging both in the United States and in other countries and societies about how much sort of public history there is. And, if you use the old saw of news as, a first draft of history, obviously it touches on the news, but the notion that, massive amounts of genealogy are online and public, for example, the very interesting discussions around Wikipedia. I think you're all familiar with Wikipedia, but one thing you may not know about Wikipedia is the process by which they decide, should we have an article on this? And in particular, you will note that there are a very, very large number of biographical articles on Wikipedia dealing with individuals or organizations, real, sometimes not real. You can find, very detailed coverage of certain fictional universes on there. But they have actually a marvelous policy document on there where they've struggled with the question of noteworthiness. Who is significant enough to rate a biographical entry on Wikipedia? And the various pro and con arguments on that, and the people feeling disenfranchised because they don't get to have one, seems to me to be another kind of thread that is underpinning this. And, of course, how we interconnect things like Wikipedia, which have a somewhat more synthesized and encyclopedic quality to the broader news enterprise, is another fascinating question. Another one.
So, Martin, is this on? Martin Halbert, University of North Texas. Cliff, you've worked in libraries, and you have worked in major change, implementation, the thing that Ed talked about, the implementation of Melville and all that. Would you speculate a little about, so I don't know what to call this transition that we're in, but in the old days, libraries had a general idea of what they were supposed to do about preserving the past, right? You had newspapers, and maybe you collected them and put them on the shelf, and as you said, let them survive through benign neglect. Now the range, you've highlighted in your talk the range of types of information that are out there that are problematized in terms of even being able to preserve them or acquire them, or I like your term, hoover them in. What do you think libraries and other sorts of cultural, invent an amorphous term, cultural memory institutions, right? That maybe we understand, how do they change their roles and their expertise and their background, and what they invest in fundamentally in terms of expertise and infrastructure, because you need very different infrastructure to crawl the web and preserve it than buy newspapers and put them on a shelf. And how are we going to make that transition? Is it going to happen? For whom? I'd be interested in your speculation on this, because this is a big transition that I don't know if or how we're going to make it.
That's a wonderful question, and I can't even begin to give you a full set of speculations. We haven't got time, but let me just highlight a couple things that I think maybe hope are going to happen. So I think the really big news organizations that have huge archives that are clearly of lasting value are probably best handled through some kind of group negotiation. There's no reason for every library to replicate that. We need some kind of consortial structure. And I think ideas like escrow are terribly important here. So one of the things that happened back about 10 years ago is that most scholarly journals made the transition from print to digital form and are now kind of in the wind down of even producing print editions. One of the critical issues that research libraries raised and authors and readers of these journals raised was, how are we going to ensure that these are around in the future? We can't have a scholarly record that we're not confident will endure. And in some ways, this was a very fast conversation because the marketplace for these journals, which in electronic form are hosted typically on publisher websites or platform providers that offer services to the publishers, the authors and the people who paid for the subscriptions were basically all clustered in the research library community. And so schemes were developed where essentially the publishers put copies of their material in escrow in certain organizations that were set up to receive, validate, and preserve that. So that, again, you had them spread around with some resilience for, different kinds of failures, financial failures by publishers, failures of stewardship, all kinds of events. And so far, this has worked reasonably well. It's a nice kind of redundant and multifaceted system. I think we may need to think about doing that for the really large news corpora, and to do that as a matter of sort of public interest as much as anything else. I think when we get into smaller or more local or specialized things, there is a fantastic range of opportunities for partnership among specialist organizations, public libraries, historical societies, and other players to build up connections with various kinds of journalistic organizations to help with stewardship. I think that there's a problem of scale there, and to some extent of expertise, in that your smaller institutions, especially smaller public libraries, which have not exactly been lavishly funded in the last few decades, what they need to do is do the things they can do uniquely about selecting and relationship building, and have some kind of underlying shared platforms or services that can take care of a lot of the mechanics of the digital archiving. So those are two pieces of the puzzle. I think the other really hard piece, because it requires serious sort of thinking out of the box, is stepping back and saying, what constitutes the broad cultural record in the digital age? And what parts of it are we doing a fairly good job of capturing, often because it's familiar and is an extension of things that went on in the pre-digital age? And what parts are just new and we're not seeing them because they're new, and somehow we can't get our heads around the fact that they are genuinely important parts of the cultural record, and that some class of cultural memory organizations, either extant or to be created, need to deal with them. That's the third piece, and it's a very hard piece. I think we're out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Clifford.